Hey everyone, welcome to this year's Force for Positive Change event. My name is Kelsey Otero and I am one of the co-hosts. And on behalf of our entire committee, we are so excited that you all are able to join us virtually this year. The Force for Positive Change is a unique competition and event. It creates convergence across sectors around a big idea. And that idea is the radical notion that it is possible to run businesses and nonprofits with a balanced focus on social impact and financial sustainability. When we originally started planning this year's Force for Positive Change event, we planned to host it on the UW-Eau Claire University campus. However, COVID disrupted all of our plans and didn't allow for in-person event. And luckily, we were able to pivot and still offer a virtual event. And we are excited this afternoon to bring you a full afternoon of panels, talks, workshops, and awards. At this point, I want to offer a land recognition and a moment of gratitude in honor of our original intention to be present in Western Wisconsin for the Force for Positive Change event. We acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire occupies the sacred and ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. We honor the land of the Ojibwe and Dakota nations. We want to thank the UW-Eau Claire team and community for all of their support and commitment to this event. I also want to highlight and acknowledge that April is Hmong Heritage Month. Communities across the state are featuring celebrations and cultural events that we hope you're able to join. We want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the many ways in which Wisconsin's Hmong communities enrich us all. And before we kick off with our first speaker, I want to thank and recognize the sponsors that made today's event and awards possible. Please join me in recognizing our funding sponsors, John and Tasha Morgridge, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Marquette University 707 Hub, American Family Insurance and American Family Insurance Institute, Promega, and the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. I would also like to thank the members of our statewide steering committee, competition judges, who have all given their time, reached out to their network, and shared their expertise to make this event and competition the force for positive change that it is. Thank you to all our sponsors and partners. And speaking of forces for positive change, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing and welcoming our keynote for today, David Bornstein. David is the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, which is integrating solutions journalism into mainstream news. He co-writes the Fixes column for the New York Times and is the author of a number of books that I think should probably be required reading for anyone interested in social innovation and social impact. Some of these include How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas, The Price of a Dream, the story of the Grameen Bank, and Social Entrepreneurship, what everyone needs to know. David is going to talk with us today about the power of stories and storytelling, helping to illustrate how solutions journalism is a tool to move from problems to possibilities in our ever-changing world. David is going to take questions at the end, so feel free at any point to drop those into the Q&A, and our chat will also be open if anything strikes you that he says that you want to be able to acknowledge or share with the rest of the group that is on today. And with that, David, I'll turn it over to you to provide and kick off your talk today. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Kelsey, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to just share my screen to talk about stories. You know, someone once said to me that we think the world is made of atoms, but really, in fact, the world is made of stories. And in fact, you know, we live inside a world that's very much mediated by people who come and tell us what it's like. And the way, as this quote from Walter Lippmann shows, the way in which the world is imagined, what we choose to focus our attention on, and what happens to come into our lives really does determine what we will do, how we will live our lives. It determines what we fear, what we hope for, what we can aspire for, how we think we can use this time on earth before the unknown comes again. And so what I'd like to talk about is just to help people understand that the stories we get about the world are very much biased and that there are really alternative ways to see reality. This is pretty much, in the days of newsprint, the idea of the world that's beamed into our homes now when our phones 24/7. And of course, COVID would be there, and you would have political dysfunction, and you would have all sorts of other things on this list. But this is a version of reality that the news bias tells us is really what reality is. But in fact, it's a very limited view of the world. And just to illustrate that, before COVID, many years ago, we had the Ebola crisis. And I don't know if you remember the news, but for a few months, it looked like Western civilization or civilization around the planet was going to collapse. I mean, the extraordinary amount of fear that was driven by the coverage of Ebola, it led to people almost collapsing their hope. What ensued was pretty much an extraordinary containment effort in many African countries, and then the fastest, or at least until then, the fastest development of a vaccine ever. It was a story here that the BBC covered it a little bit, a few news organizations covered it, but I would venture to say that if you asked 100 people on the street, how many of them realized that the Ebola vaccine was an extraordinary sort of dragon slaying example in the world? Most people would have never heard these stories. They heard the fear, but they didn't hear the story of the hope and of the possibility. And that's pretty much my point today, is if we feed stories like this to people every day, and as this quote is a summary, a distillation of a lot of social science, but it basically, when people have low efficacy, when they have a low sense of control, anxiety-inducing news leads to fear, helplessness, and a desire to tune out. We know that that's really bad for democracy. It's one of the primary motivations for people seeking misinformation and disinformation and believing in conspiracy theories comes from a sense of powerlessness, a sense of lack of control. So many of the things that we're seeing today in our democracy are driven by this kind of narrative of brokenness that is kind of a daily problem that we face. I've been a journalist for 30 years. I started in the late 80s, and I had a wonderful experience in the early 90s because I quit my daily newspaper job and I went to Bangladesh, and I ended up spending 4 years writing a book about the Grameen Bank, which is the Nobel Prize winning organization that pioneered the idea of microfinance, small loans to villagers to help alleviate poverty. And it was an extraordinary experience for me because I spent many years looking at how do you actually build an organization that reduces poverty, and got to see this idea of microfinance grow and grow and grow until it was reaching literally billions of people. And ultimately, the Grameen Bank won the Nobel Peace Prize. But it was an extraordinary hinge moment in my life where the question, how do you actually, what is really possible? The bank was just created by one person, an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur named Muhammad Yunus, who had this vision of a new kind of institution in our society, a new kind of business, whose goal would be to put poverty in a museum, something that we would, imagine is sort of impossible today. But as I started traveling around the world looking at social entrepreneurs, I started to see that there were many such examples of places where people were doing things that we might think are improbable, if not impossible. So this is a story about, this is a photo of that reflects the work of an organization in India called Childline, which was started by a social worker who had worked with a lot of the youth living on the streets of India. There's a lot of homeless youth and homeless people across the country. And she ended up deciding just to create a network, a hotline. This was even before cell phones existed. And she started it with a few NGOs. She got the government to give her a free telephone number. It took years to make this happen. But this system, Childline, has become the national child protection system across India, and responsible for fielding millions of calls where youth are on the streets and need health attention, medical attention, protection, and so forth. It all really grew out of the personal interactions of one social worker named Jaru Bilamuria. When I was in South Africa, this was during the AIDS crisis. A nurse that I met in a place called Mamelodi, which is near Pretoria, former township, had created the first palliative care program in South Africa to care for people who at that time had HIV or AIDS. And it was really just young people that she trained as being nurses or paraprofessionals, since there was no money to do this. She ended up creating a model that was ultimately adopted by many of the provincial governments in South Africa for palliative care. When I was in Brazil, I ended up having the privilege of meeting a man who had brought electricity to more than 20 million people through the use of decentralized solar electricity that the government later adopted under Lula's administration. This man was one of the recipients of electricity, and the reason why he has a saint on his battery is because it was a reminder of him that the battery was sort of holy. It was the thing that would keep his children healthy because they wouldn't be inhaling kerosene gas. They would be getting clean energy from solar. And this is probably the most remarkable story I've ever come across. And most people have never heard of Jim Grant, who led UNICEF from 1982 to 1995 and advanced what became known as the Child Survival Revolution, which essentially increased global vaccination rates from 20% to approximately 70 to 80%, depending on different countries. The Encyclopedia Britannica, for those of you who still remember that source, credited it 10 years or 15 years ago of having saved more than 25 million lives using low-cost medical treatments like oral rehydration salts, which basically cost a dime. And at the time that Jim Grant was doing this, 5 million children a year were dying from dehydration that this was helping to stop. So you have these extraordinary stories all around the world. This is just a handful of what's available. And as I have traveled around the world gathering these kinds of stories, it really struck me that journalism did not have a normal language to carry these stories. It didn't treat them as an important story. So I had this opportunity 10 years ago with my colleague, Tina Rosenberg, to start a column at the New York Times called Fixes, which would look regularly for stories about how people were solving social problems. And one of the things that we found, which was sort of contradictory to what we had been told, is that when we told stories, even very hard stories, through a solutions lens, without overclaiming, without hero worship, without silver bullet kind of puffery, people really responded to them. This was the illustration that an artist used for a story that I had written about child trauma and a very particular intervention in Head Start programs across the state of Missouri that were remarkably effective in helping young children who had trauma learning to calm themselves and actually cool down and handle the trauma in their bodies. And it was showing that the children were able to learn better, they were able to develop friendships better. It was really having very good effects. So I wrote this story, which is about a very dark issue through the lens of what's possible. And this was a real sort of light bulb. The story became the most emailed story in the New York Times and the most shared on Facebook for a week, which is very unusual for a story about child trauma. It's very hard to get people to engage with difficult stories. But when you engage with the story through the lens of what can we do about it, what's working, or what can we learn from this approach, people really wanted those stories. And I think that's the biggest opportunity we have today in journalism, and also to fix this kind of narrative of brokenness that is bringing us all down. Now, journalism has historically taken these stories and put them into the hero story mode. This is CNN Heroes is a Thanksgiving TV show that is basically seasonal fare. It's a kind of a lead into Christmas kind of thing. And that's where solution stories have historically been put. They've been sort of, the weekend pages and the holiday pages. And so what we had the idea to do, Tina Rosenberg and I and Courtney Martin and a number of other journalists, was to create a new organization, which we called the Solutions Journalism Network, to teach journalists how to do reporting on solutions, why this is so important, and why it will help us get out of some of the ruts we are facing in our society and our democracy. So I just want to sort of give a little bit of explanation. I'm trying not to have too many slides with words here, but it's really important that solutions journalism is not puffery, it's not hero worship. It's really rigorous reporting that looks at responses to a problem, how it came about, how it's working. It provides whatever evidence is available of the results, looking at what's effective, not just the intentions. It seeks to provide insights that will help other people solve similar kinds of problems, not just inspiration. And it's candid about the limitations and the barriers, so that it's not trying to present these solutions as panaceas or silver bullets. In essence, what we're trying to do with journalism is to take the old idea of the watchdog, which was guarding you, telling you what you should fear, what you should worry about, and add on a role of a guide dog. It's not enough to uncover wrongdoing. People need to know their options. When people have a sense of efficacy and control, they're much more likely to engage. They're much less likely to circle the wagons and to discriminate. So we've been at it now for 8 years, and we've actually worked with more than 500 news organizations. We've trained and engaged with more than 20,000 journalists, and we've gotten to the point where solutions journalism has really become a legitimate form of reporting. It's something that news organizations around the world are increasingly using, and it's a way of balancing the news so that it's really a feedback system that helps us improve. And as if any of you have ever studied feedback systems, there's two things that you need in a system in terms of information to get better. You need to understand what the problems are, what the threats are, what the urgent things that you need to focus on. And you need to know what you can do about them, what you can do about them. What are your options at any point in time? What's available for us to work with? And that's really ultimately what this work is about. One of the things I wanted to mention is that one of the really great partnerships we've had over the years has been with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, which has done great solutions reporting for many years. And a couple of years ago, they actually shifted over their whole editorial section to focus more and more on solutions journalism as a kind of theme in the editorial section. So I encourage you to check it out if you haven't read that. Okay, so what kinds of stories build moral imagination? That was the title of the talk. And so I wanted to just come up with sort of a few key ideas for those of you. You don't have to be a journalist or a writer, but we're all in the business of storytelling. If you run a nonprofit, if you're a fundraiser, if you're trying to inspire anyone to get involved in any kind of aspiration that you have, you're going to be telling stories. That's how you get people excited about things. That's how you motivate people. So the first thing to ask, and this is something we talk about with journalists a lot, is what's missing from the public understanding? When you decide, I'm going to tell this story, why are you going to tell it? Is that a story that's needed? What will it add to what's currently available? And so in this case, one of the things that we can look at is just a simple sort of flow sheet of questions. So most journalism is about problems. So the first thing we want to ask is, does the public know about the problem? Do they know that it exists? If so, if they don't, then you have to expose it. That's the first thing. We need to get people's attention. Why is it happening? What harm is it causing? But in many cases, if we talk about political polarization, if we talk about disinformation, if we talk about climate change, most people know that the problem exists and most people are actually concerned about it. But what is usually missing for many problems like crime, other things, is what can be done about it. And that's really where you get to solutions journalism, where there's high awareness about the problem, but low awareness or low efficacy. Solutions journalism is really what's missing. And I would say for many stories that journalists cover, solutions journalism is really the missing ingredient. It's the missing ingredient in the soup that would make it better. If people know about a problem and what can be done about it, then the traditional journalism role of maintaining pressure and accountability is still very valid. So after you've sort of answered that question, we have a phrase called positive deviance, looking for the positive deviance. And what that basically says is, if you look at the variation in performance on any issue, who's doing better against solving crime? Who's doing better in terms of rebuilding COVID? Which communities have the best response to opioids or meth? Which communities are helping their elders? Have the most, live in the best environments. And we call them the positive deviance. Journalism usually looks for the negative deviance in order to mobilize outrage, but it's the positive deviance that allow you to learn. That's where the knowledge is for how we can do better. So we have a resource that's connected to solutions journalism, where we have actually gathered solution stories from partners around the world that we've worked with, trained, connected with in some way. And it's an extraordinary resource. There's more than 11,000 stories in it, from news outlets all around the world. And these are stories about positive deviance. These are stories of examples of places that are doing better, taking a better approach to a problem, or trying something new. I did a quick search last night, and I found that we have 100 stories, more than 100 stories that are focused on solutions in the state of Wisconsin. So if you're curious about what's happening at the state level, you can search here by that. You can also look by issue area and so forth. And sort of just to give you an example of the kind of stories that you'll stumble upon if you look at the world through the lens of solutions journalism, you find things like this. So which country is doing the best around the world in terms of recycling food waste, which is a huge contributor to things like methane emissions, and is also just a general hazard. So South Korea has managed to go from 2% to 95%. Now, we call these stories how done. It's the question of how they did it. Is it locally idiosyncratic, or is it something that other countries can learn from? Is it something that our state or our city could learn from? Generally speaking, in the solution stories, there are insights that could inform many people around the world. These are either how you solve a problem is not always distinct to one area. This is another example that's really interesting. So in the United States, 1 in 5 people who are incarcerated in a state or federal institution has gotten COVID. That's close to 400,000 people. In Norway, it's 1 in 70, right? It's an extraordinarily more successful approach that they took. Now, they have a much smaller prison population, but they've also just done a bunch of really smart things in order to protect people who are incarcerated, and we could learn from them at many different levels. Similarly, for those of you who remember, Seattle had the worst outbreak of COVID a year ago. And today it is the lowest among the 20 largest regional areas in the United States in terms of its COVID rates. So what has Seattle done that shows what we could be doing here in our town, in our state? And in fact, this article suggests that more than 300,000 people, deaths could have been avoided had more places adopted the policies that Seattle adopted after the initial experience. We hear about, obviously, global warming is a huge problem, deforestation, but there are some places around the world that are reforesting, and in a surprising way. This is an article from the publication NCIA, which does great environmental reporting, looking at how has Malawi reforested areas that had been denuded for many years, giving people alternative ways of cooking, incentives for planting trees. Most of these things are pretty logical, but the way that they did it and the way they advanced the policy is telling for any region that would like to do something similar. This is a really moving story from The Guardian about a drop of more than 90% drop in the state in 1,000 villages in Uttar Pradesh in terms of maternal mortality, and a 60% drop in terms of child mortality. And this has all been done through networks of village health workers, women who are trained to be village health workers. So just imagine, these are 5 stories. Imagine 10,000 stories like this, and imagine getting these stories every day from your news feed rather than the worst tweet of the day or the normal kinds of news that we get. And you can begin to imagine what is available to us in terms of pathways in our own lives, pathways for solving problems, and the amount of information that we can learn from other people around the world who are a year or two ahead of us in terms of solving problems that we are also facing. So the third point that I want to make is to look at this idea of asset framing, which is a new idea that we are integrating into our work at Solutions Journalism. The idea of asset framing comes from a social entrepreneur named Trabian Shorters, who founded an organization called Be Me Community. And the idea is very simple. Asset framing is the principle that you should define a community by its aspirations and contributions rather than challenges and deficits. So what does that mean? If you read the news, you will find every single day stories about at-risk youth, or dropouts. You have these tropes that come up over and over. When you describe someone in journalism as a dropout, you're basically defining them as the problem. Now, if you ask that person, what is their aspiration? Most of the time they'll say, I'd love to finish high school. I'd love to go to college. So another way of describing that person is someone who aspires to graduate from high school, but who is lacking the support they need. They aspire to finish high school, they're lacking the support. The reason why telling a story this way is so transformative is because the cognitive science says very clearly, when you define someone by a problem, you're inviting people to mobilize against them as a threat. You're actually defining them as a problem, as a threat, as maybe a person who's less worthy. However, if you define them by their aspirations and you show that their aspirations are being thwarted, you mobilize to fight the system that is thwarting their aspirations. You mobilize against the system that is preventing young people from being able to complete high school, a poor school system, not enough money, whatever the issue is. It's a fundamental distinction, but you can imagine how often journalists and all of us define people by their problems. We do it unconsciously all the time. And so remembering the asset frame, the frame that what's most real about a person is their aspirations. Their challenges are their situations, but their aspirations tell you what they really care about. And finally, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop shortly after this one, because I think this is a very personal, and I want to, I'd love people to think about this and see if there's questions that come up. One of the things that we've noticed in journalism and why journalism contributes to the intense polarization that we have in the United States. I mean, you have a country where half the people not only disagree with the way the other half have voted in the recent presidential election, but they actually see the other side as being not fully human for their actions. I mean, this is an incredible thing. Many, many Republicans towards Democrats and many Democrats towards Republicans in this country are unwilling to recognize the full humanity of people who have behaved politically in different ways. Now, one of the most powerful things that we learned, we've worked with conflict mediators to try to understand when you have deep conflict, what works to actually unwind that conflict. And it turns out that facts are actually pretty unimportant. You're not going to win any argument with someone who deeply disagrees with you in a high conflict setting by trying to convince them, that the election wasn't stolen or the election was stolen, depending on how they have fallen on that line. However, if you ask questions that complicate the narrative, that get underneath deeper levels of meaning in their lives, it's kind of amazing what opens up. We've seen this happen over and over again. So look at some of these questions. What are the life experiences that have shaped your views? How did you come to this? If somebody answers that question and it's around how they vote or why they believe such and such an issue, I'm going to learn about where that view emerged. They might end up saying people spit on my father when he returned from Vietnam. That's why to this very day, ... You can just fill in the blank and you begin to understand how we become the people we are, how our views are formed. For those who disagree with you, what would you like them to understand about you? For the other side, what do you want them to know about you? This is an amazing question. Imagine for a moment, you're talking to a person who's very politically engaged that you disagree with. Imagine for a moment that you got what you wanted in regards to this issue, you got everything you wanted. How would your life change? Most of the time, people don't even know. They've been so involved in the fight that they forgot to even look at what does this really mean anymore? I mean, the fight's been going on for generations. They forgot what caused it. What do you want to understand about those with whom you disagree with? What do you think? What don't you get about them? So these are kinds of questions we have on our blog. We have 22 questions that complicate the narrative, as well as a really powerful essay that shows just how you can ask questions that lead you to understandings where you can tell stories that complicate the narrative, that move us away from these binary ways, these white and black ways of looking at the world, good and evil, and so forth. And in my view, this is one of the most powerful things that journalism can do today, is to tell stories that help us rehumanize people on the other side. And I hope that we see a lot more of this happening. But by the way, you can ask these questions at home. You can ask them with your relatives who you can't stand talking to at Thanksgiving, all of these things. This is a very personal thing. I've done this with people in my life. So just finally, like, I want to bring this back to a really immediate reality. This is from the New York Times recently. They did an analysis of the COVID-19 coverage. So in the United States, close to 90% of news coverage, and it's been consistent for the last year, has been negative, right? It's much higher, in fact, than it is at the local level. The national news is the worst. The local level is better, and international news is actually not nearly as negative. We have the most negative news in the world right now. But just look at this. So Biden was elected, takes office in January, and his first target was 1 million. Everyone said that's not enough. So they're like, we're going to do 1.5 million. Everyone's nervous because they don't know if it's an achievable goal. And then this was published in the Washington Post just a few days ago. 4 million people received a vaccine. This is just a few months ago. People didn't even think a vaccine could be developed within 18 months. And now we're 2.5 times higher what the goal was just in January. We forget what is going on in the world today and what is possible if we're constantly living in this news narrative that's focused on what's wrong, what's broken, what's pathological. So for me, as a kind of inoculation to despair, having access to solution stories has been extraordinarily important in my life. It's helped me be hopeful at times where things look really bleak, and we've all gone through such a hard year. Many people have gone through much harder years than others. And to see what's available in terms of the humanity, the kindness, the compassion, the creativity is really balm in Gilead. And I highly encourage you to look for these kinds of stories and to think of the kind of stories in your own life that can help you achieve your goals, because we can choose much more skillfully. So finish with a quote from Maimonides, which is a kind of rigorous definition of hope. A definition we can actually even use with journalists. Hope is a belief in the plausibility of the possible, as opposed to the necessity of the probable. We are often facing challenges where the odds are against us, but there are always possibilities. And to look at what's plausible, what can be done, what's emerging, what's growing, to make that what we focus on as well, give that our attention, water those seeds. That is the way alternative futures become born. So thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and thank you again. I'm gonna stop sharing. So, Kelsey, how are we doing with the questions? Oh, can't hear you. Yeah.
That would help if I unmuted. Thank you for such a well-rounded talk, and you covered so many topics that I think are applicable to social entrepreneurs, fundraisers, nonprofit organizations, and those of us passionate about having conversations and developing our own curiosity. So I thank you, and I want to say a lot of comments came into the Q&A. I'm going to start with our first question. Can the news industry get past the balancing test? In other words, every time we hear factual information on something like climate change, it seems journalists also feel compelled to showcase an extreme minority opinion in the name of balance.
Yeah, that kind of false objectivity, or what has been called the view from nowhere by Jay Rosen, is something that we're seeing more and more journalists getting away from. You don't really see the false equivalency around climate change anymore. I haven't seen it for quite a number of years, except maybe in publications that are more biased for that particular thing. So I think that there is a movement in journalism now to the false objectivity, the idea that we don't have a point of view, or that there is not a preponderance of evidence on one side versus another side, is something that journalists, I think, are becoming much more skillful in dealing with. And that's a hopeful sign.
Thanks. I love this next question. The solutions journalism network approach that you talked about in your talk seems to transcend journalism as a principle or professional skill set. What might you envision in terms of imparting this solutions-focused mindset elsewhere or in other industries?
Oh, that's a great question. there's one of the things that we're trying to do now, and if anyone out there wants to help, there's a lot of people now who don't get their news from journalists. They get their news from social media personalities. You can call them, I don't know, I mean, just influencers, or, that's not a name, that's not a word I usually like. That's often how they're referred to. They are sense makers. They're people who gather information. They often do a lot of reading, and then they pull it together, and then they send out what their take on what is happening. And their issue might be climate, their issue might be race, their issue might be health. So we're also helping people who are these sense makers and sometimes they have millions of followers on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook or whatever, helping them understand that the way you tell stories will ultimately shape people's behavior. So working with influencers, but I think it's a very good point, and we would be very welcome with people coming and engaging us and looking at the solution story tracker and trying to understand, how could I use these stories to build morale in my organization? Maybe we could have a once a week conversation about a solution and debate. Is this a good solution? How did it work? What could we learn from the strategic principles that might inform our company or our nonprofit or our foundation? I think bringing in looking for insights, constantly trying to look for strategic patterns. You can also get these stories, and you can decide to reach out to the people on the ground that are quoted in the stories and say, is it still working? It's been a year, or it's been 5 years. Is the thing still running? What was your biggest mistake? So I think that once you are open to the idea that we can learn from positive deviance, once you're recognizing that the right end of the bell curve, the positive deviance, has more to teach you than the left end of the bell curve, the bad actors, that's when you can really open up extraordinary learning opportunities in your life. And all my great teachers, whether it's Bill Drayton at Ashoka or Muhammad Yunus at the Grameen Bank, or other people who have solved problems, their curiosity is extraordinary, and it's a way of looking at the world that feeds curiosity and actually doesn't feed judgment as much, because our judgment is a closing way of looking at something. When we need to, I don't like this, or I don't like that, or I have to impose judgment on that, we actually end the conversation.
I love that. That seems like a great role that universities and educational institutions can help play as well in perpetuating
Can I add to that?
Yes.
We have a lot of educational institutions that use the solution story tracker and use it to inform their curriculum. We work with quite a number of educators across the country where they bring these stories. It's very hard to find solution stories if you just go to Google News. But if you go through this, if you're teaching a course on environmentalism or social change or behavior change or social enterprise, you can find lots of examples here that can be, the students can use to inform their research, class discussions, and so forth.
Awesome. I want to stay on the same topic for a second because we had a great question come in. How do we find this type of solutions journalism news when so many of us live in a bubble that is, with an algorithm that is driving the news that we see? I know you mentioned some sources in your talk. What other advice do you have?
Yeah, so it's hard. I mean, if you're getting your news from social media, we have not cracked that problem. I don't really understand. I do know, I mean, we've worked with Google, and if you have an Android phone and you speak into your Android phone, into Google Assistant, and you say, hey, Google, tell me something good, it will read back solutions journalism to you that these are things that we have created with Google. You can also use Google Assistant on an iPhone, but you have to use the Google Assistant app on the iPhone. Now, in terms of social media feeds, that's a hard challenge. We haven't figured that one. You can look for solutions journalism by Googling that phrase and the news, and stories increasingly will come up that are tagged as solutions journalism. Some news organizations use that tag, or they'll use that phrase, or it will occur in the news article. The other thing is, if you come to the solution story tracker, you begin to see which news organizations are actually practicing solutions journalism more often. There's about 50 news organizations that have verticals, like The Guardian has something called The Upside. At the Times, we had Fixes column, which is in flux right now. But many new, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel has their editorial section. So we have a blog called The Whole Story, which is connected to our website, which is just solutionsjournalism.org. And on the blog, there's a list of, I think, 50 news organizations that have solutions journalism verticals, which means that they regularly post stories within that vertical. So you can connect to your feeds to those verticals as well. But at this point, you do have to look for it. You have to hunt for it. It's not coming to people as regularly as it could. So that's something we hope will change a lot in the coming years. And by the way, if you request it, if you find ways to request it of news organizations, of your feeds, if you can give the feedback to the places that you're loyal to, that would be really helpful to getting more of it.
David, how do you measure the impact or success of a solutions journalism approach?
Well, so when we are working with a news organization, we sort of do a baseline at the beginning, like, do they even believe that solutions journalism is okay to do? Do they think it's advocacy? Is it something that they think is social engineering? There's lots of defensiveness to this idea initially. But now that we've worked with so many news organizations, we understand all the problems. But over time, we look at how do attitudes in the news organization and among journalists themselves change once they begin doing news this way. And the biggest impact is journalists saying, I'm never going back. This is a more powerful way for me to inform and engage audiences and provide them with the information they need to become the community they want to become. So that's sort of attitudinal change among journalists and others, editors, producers, is really important. The next thing is we're able to show news organizations that it actually opens up new sources of revenues, that people actually don't want the news to constantly make them feel depressed and powerless. Nobody wants to feel depressed and powerless, and yet people do want to be informed. And so when the news shifts and the news organization asks people, do you like it? They say yes. They say, yes, we like it a lot. Thank you. And then some news organizations will say, do you like it enough to pay us more money for it, or to subscribe, or to make a grant to us, or to be a business that sponsors this coverage? And increasingly more news partners are beginning to see that this is a really good way to drive revenues. And then finally, the impact on the ground. Many journalists see that when they write about solutions, people explore these ideas. The local town council or the government says, oh, we should look into this, or more pressure is put on local authorities saying, why aren't you doing what Cleveland's doing? Why aren't you doing what Minneapolis is doing? They have a better response than we're having to the same problem. So there's an accountability role as well that solutions journalism serves by showing that better performance is possible. And so our poor performance is illegitimate. We cannot, you've taken away our excuses. All of these things are ways that you can really measure the differential impact and effect of solutions journalism.
We are getting some amazing questions coming in, so I want to jump to the next one right away. How can organizations working on solutions tell their own stories? And I want to add on to that too. We have a lot of social entrepreneurs on the call today. What advice do you have for them if they want to maybe pitch the solutions that they're working on to a journalist and try and get some coverage, or really be able to spread the story of the good work that they're doing?
Yeah, so one thing you can do is look through the solution story tracker, and that's a great way to get names of journalists who write about solutions. I mean, there's 11,000 stories, and they come from contributors across the world. And these are journalists. You can see who's written quite a number of solution stories and about what issues, and are any of them in my state or any of them in my region. So that's just, hey, I'm writing to you because I read your story in the solution story tracker, and I see you're interested in this, and I have an interesting idea for you. That's one simple thing. Another thing is, we have a checklist when you submit a story to the solution story tracker, or if you just go to our blog, for what constitutes a good solution story. It was the 4 things that I mentioned earlier. When you're pitching to a journalist, not over-claiming, showing that this is a response to a problem, not claiming that it is a panacea. acknowledging the limitations, because as soon as you acknowledge the limitations, the journalist will feel that it's more trustworthy. You're not trying to pitch them, a perfect thing. So, and then we have a framework that we call a how done it. For those of you who like to read detective stories, you're probably familiar with the phrase who done it, like Agatha Christie or Sherlock Holmes. A how done it is kind of like a detective story, but it's driven by curiosity about how are these people or how is this organization solving this really hard problem. And the idea is that what drives the narrative is curiosity, not sort of, wholesomeness, or you should read this the same way that you should eat broccoli. What drives the narrative is how are they going to solve this problem? How are they going to get the teachers to show up to the meeting? Or how are they going to get this thing financed? Or did it really work? Or how are they going to move from one town to another once they've demonstrated in their pilot phase? These are all the kinds of things that people have to deal with when they're trying to solve problems. And they're interesting questions. And when you frame them as questions, people are like, yeah, how did you do that? Well, what happened next? And, just the way I read 4,000 pages out loud to my son and wife of Harry Potter. It was like, how's Harry going to get out of this mess? How's Hermione going to get out of this mess? I mean, the whole thing was, and then ultimately, like, how's Harry going to beat Voldemort, in the final battle? But curiosity is the most powerful driver of attention. And the greatest thing that you can do telling a story about your nonprofit or your social enterprise is to frame it as a how done it, so that people are constantly curious about all, and all of you, I've interviewed so many people solving problems and running organizations. They're all solving different levels of challenges, and those challenges get more sophisticated and more complicated the more advanced and the further along that they get. And so in storytelling terminology, they're called rising barriers. That's what the storytellers call it. You have conflict, you have rising barriers. That creates more interest when the barriers rise. Just think of any story that you like watching, or any TV show like CSI, Special Victims Unit. I mean, they start in the first moment. In the first moment, there's a question. How are they going to solve this case? How are they going to catch the bad guys in this case? You know that they're always going to do it. The question is, how are they going to do it? And if you watch the first minute, you're hooked for the hour. You can do that with really good stories about solutions as well.
I love how you frame curiosity as a superpower. And I think that's, a great way to kind of think about the hero's journey and unleashing a power in all of us. Last question for the day, and then we're going to have to head into our breakout sessions. How can participants that were on today's session that were really inspired by the resources and the story that you shared help spread some of the resources and the narrative around the importance of solutions journalism work with those that they know?
Well, thank you so much for asking that. First of all, to whatever degree you have relationships with anyone in media, please tell them, this is a really important idea. It's not just for our organization. We're open sourcing this. We want to give this IP away to any news organization. So anyone you're interested in, anyone has an interest in media or doing creative things, please send us our way, and we'd be very happy to connect with them and provide any resources we can that they can integrate this to their work, their coverage. If you're a consumer of news, whatever bully pulpit you have, whether it's social media, to make it clear to the people that follow you or you're in touch with that we can do better in our journalism, and it will make us better as citizens, as the public, and as, in terms of even our relationships with one another. We have a lot of social, resources on social media that you can follow, like our Twitter account. Sol Journo is our Twitter account. We're on Instagram and things like that. But I really think, in the long run, and we have a Twitter tag called a whole story. Whenever you see solutions journalism, tweet it back to us, and we'll put it in the story tracker so we can continue to add stories to that, especially stories that are hard to find from smaller outlets around the country or around the world. We really want to have more local news organizations being tracked for this, because it's harder for the local news organizations to get attention at the national level. But the thing about solution stories is they're almost always national stories, or they're more likely to be national stories, because nobody cares about the problem in your town. I'm not mean to say that negatively, but problems are very local. but the way our town solved our problem related to better caring for our elders is of interest to every town in America, because we all have the same problems. So tweeting about those stories to us, we can then amplify them. That's a good way to get them to policymakers. It's a good way to get them in front of people who can fund them, foundation folks and all that. Just really moving that out it's one step at a time to create a real system change is what we're all about.
Awesome. We had one more question come in that hopefully you can address in about 30 seconds, David. What you said about enlisting our natural curiosity is so compelling. The brain is wired to attend to negativity as a self-preservation mechanism. Mainstream media capitalizes on this, but humans are also wired for compassion and connection. Do you feel making people more aware of how media works to cycle fear, a useful strategy for changing the conversation?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I think it's low-hanging fruit to build your business model on resentment and fear and outrage. We know that you can get people to click on things very easily, but we see what the effects of all around the world. We see what's happening when we have a 24/7 fear machine. So knowing that about ourselves and knowing that about the people we love, we have to assert control over our attention. I mean, this is exactly what people do in mindfulness. They decide, what am I going to pay attention to? And what am I going to actually not pay attention to? We have more control. So if you're totally stressed out by what's happening in the world or the country or COVID or whatever is going on in your life, you actually can intentionally pull in information into your life that will expand your heart, that will make you feel calmer, that will make you care about groups that you have a real trouble caring about, because you're going to find that nothing is white or black. There's gray everywhere. And so this is possible. We can all do it with ourselves. We can do it with other people. But it does take, we're evolved to love awe and to fear, rattlesnakes and bad things and all that stuff. That is all true. And so we have a lot of options with our attention. We don't have to be reactive. We don't have to be controlled by our conditioned responses. We can choose. And I think choosing what you pay attention to is probably the most important choice anyone can make.
Thank you, David. Absolute delight to have you here. And all of our attendees today have a choice to make right now. We just posted the next sessions for our 1 o'clock Central Standard Time session. So if you guys want to select those, we will be seeing you in the breakouts in just a moment. And for those of you who were blown away at David's words, just know that we did record this session, so you will be able to go back, listen in again, and really dig into some of the frameworks and advice that he shared with us today. So thank you for joining us for the keynote. We look forward to seeing you in the breakout sessions. David, thank you again for your wisdom and the curiosity